Imagine holding your child's hand for the last time. The room is quiet. The machines are silent. The doctor has already left. There is nothing left to do except say goodbye. You lean closer. You whisper their name. You promise things you will never get the chance to give. And then you leave. You believe that this moment is the end of the story. It is not, because somewhere in that same building, after you walk out, someone opens a file. Someone checks a box. Someone prepares a form. Not to save your child, but to use them. Not out of hatred, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Your child becomes a sample, a number, a data point. Their body becomes part of an experiment you were never told about. An experiment justified by fear, protected by silence, and hidden behind science. This is not a story about monsters. This is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary harm because no one told them to stop. This is a story about what happens when systems become more important than humans, when efficiency replaces empathy, when permission is replaced by authority. This is the story of Project Sunshine, and it forces us to ask a question that is still uncomfortable today. How much harm are we willing to accept if someone tells us it is necessary? In the early 1950s, a new kind of fear settled over the world. It was not the fear of armies crossing borders. It was not the fear of bombs falling from the sky. It was the fear of something invisible, something that could not be seen, smelled, or touched, but that could quietly reshape the human body over time. Radiation. The atomic bomb had ended World War II, but it had started something else entirely. It had introduced a force that did not respect borders, uniforms, or peace treaties. Fallout drifted through the atmosphere, crossed oceans, settled onto farms, cities, rivers, and towns that had nothing to do with the war. No one truly understood it. People did not know how long radiation stayed in the environment. They did not know how it behaved inside the human body. They did not know what it would do to future generations. And children frightened scientists the most. Because children were not just smaller adults. They were growing organisms. Their bones were forming. Their teeth were developing. Their cells were dividing rapidly. And radiation targets growth. One isotope became the center of attention, strontium-90. It was produced by nuclear explosions. It traveled through the atmosphere. It landed on grass. Cows ate that grass. And strontium entered milk. Milk, the symbol of health, nourishment, and childhood, became the primary pathway for radioactive contamination. Children drank more milk than anyone else, which meant children absorbed more radiation than anyone else. Inside government laboratories, scientists became alarmed. They were not villains. They were not cruel. They were terrified of what they did not know. They asked a simple but horrifying question. What is happening inside children's bodies right now? And they had no answer. They had no data. They had no measurements. They had no long-term studies. They had nothing but uncertainty. And uncertainty is unacceptable to institutions built on control. So they decided to measure it. Not publicly, not openly, not ethically. They decided to measure it quietly. Project Sunshine was born from that fear. It was presented as a scientific necessity, a national security measure, a way to protect the future. It was never presented as a moral dilemma. The logic was simple. To understand radiation, they needed human tissue. And the most useful tissue came from children. Not living children, dead children, stillborn infants, babies who died from illness, children who passed away naturally. Their teeth could show radioactive absorption. Their bones could reveal accumulation. Their organs could show distribution. So hospitals became collection points. Pathologists were instructed to remove samples. Doctors were asked to cooperate. Shipments were organized. Labels were created. Forms were signed. Everything was done professionally, calmly, neatly. There was no violence, no blood, no visible cruelty. Only procedure. And procedure hides morality. It turns decisions into tasks. It turns people into functions. It turns responsibility into paperwork. Parents were not asked, because asking creates the possibility of refusal, and refusal slows the process. It introduces emotion. It creates unpredictability, and unpredictability threatens control. So parents were removed from the equation. not by force, by omission. They simply were not included. Hospitals were easier to manage than families. Doctors were easier to instruct than citizens. Paperwork was easier than grief. And so the system flowed around the humans it could not control and focused on the components it could. Samples, records, shipments, reports. The children disappeared from the process, not physically, but morally. They became numbers. They became codes. They became data. And data does not cry. Data does not resist. Data does not ask questions. This is how harm becomes invisible, not because no one is watching, but because everyone is watching the wrong thing. They watch the charts. They watch the numbers. They watch the results. But they did not watch the cost. Because grief is not measurable. Trust is not quantifiable. Violation cannot be expressed as a percentage. So it was ignored. And that is the most dangerous part. Not that harm happened, but that it happened inside a system that did not recognize it as harm at all. To the system, everything was working. Data was flowing. Budgets were justified. Reports were being produced. Progress was being made. Only one thing was not being measured: what it felt like to be human inside that process. And that is how Project Sunshine began. Not as an act of evil, but as an act of fear. Fear of not knowing. Fear of being unprepared. Fear of losing control. And when fear becomes policy, ethics become optional. For the families, everything happened quietly. Too quietly. There were no headlines, no officials, no explanations, only a phone call, only a doctor's voice, only a sentence no parent is ever ready to hear. I'm sorry, there was nothing we could do. A small room, a still body, a final goodbye. Parents stood beside hospital beds, trying to understand how a life could end so quickly, how a future could disappear in a moment. They held hands, they whispered names, they made promises they would never be able to keep. And then they went home, to empty rooms, to silent houses, to toys that would never be touched again. They believed the worst part was over. They believed their child could finally rest. They were wrong. Inside hospitals, something else was happening. Not loudly, not violently, but efficiently. Forms were passed from one desk to another. Signatures were added. Envelopes were prepared. A tooth placed in paper. A bone wrapped carefully. A small container sealed and labeled. Everything was done respectfully, cleanly, neatly. That made it feel acceptable. That made it feel harmless. That made it feel professional. Doctors were told it was important. They were told it was for public safety. They were told it was for science. They were told it was classified. And classification feels heavy. It feels serious. It feels above questioning. Some doctors hesitated. They felt something was wrong. They felt the weight of the oath they had taken. To do no harm. But harm feels different when the patient is already dead. It feels abstract, distant, less urgent. And authority makes doubt feel inappropriate. Who were they to challenge national security? Who were they to slow progress? Who were they to question experts? So most complied. Not because they were cruel, but because they were human. And humans inside systems tend to obey, because obedience feels safe, resistance feels dangerous, silence feels easier. Parents were never told, because telling would invite questions, and questions invite refusal, and refusal threatens efficiency. So silence became policy. Silence protected the system. Silence protected the participants. Silence protected the reputation of institutions. But silence did not protect families. Families trusted. They trusted doctors. They trusted hospitals. They trusted the state. They trusted that when their child died, nothing more would be taken. That trust was broken. Not with violence, not with confrontation, but with quiet paperwork. And quiet betrayals hurt the most, because they deny people even the chance to object, even the chance to say no, even the chance to matter. And that is what made Project Sunshine so disturbing. Not the science, not the fear, not even the samples, but the removal of choice, the removal of consent, the removal of humanity from the process. It was not a crime committed in anger. It was a decision made in calmness. It was harm delivered in a soft voice, wrapped in professional language, hidden behind good intentions. And that is why it lasted so long. Because it did not look like evil. It looked like work. For decades, Project Sunshine did not feel hidden. It felt forgotten. It existed inside file cabinets, not inside memory, inside archives, not inside conversation, inside reports, not inside conscience. The people who built it moved on, retired, died, changed positions, and the program faded into administrative history. But paper remembers what people forget. And one day, someone started reading the paper. It began with historians researching Cold War science. They were not looking for scandals. They were looking for context. But context became connection. Connections became patterns. And patterns became truth. The same terms appeared again and again. The same sample codes. The same references to children's tissue. The same measurements of radioactive isotopes across different institutions, across different countries, across different decades. And one name kept appearing, Project Sunshine. Journalists joined the investigation. They filed requests. They asked questions. They were delayed, ignored, redirected. But persistence is stronger than secrecy. And eventually, documents were released, not willingly, but under pressure. And what they revealed was impossible to ignore. Human remains had been collected from children, without parental consent, for years, across borders, under official authority. When the story became public, it did not explode. It spread, slowly, like something heavy sinking into the collective mind. People read it, then reread it, then tried to understand it. Because it did not look like a crime. It did not look like abuse. It did not look like something familiar. It looked like administration. And that made it more disturbing. Parents began to recognize details, hospitals, dates, locations. Some wondered if it had happened to them. Some were afraid to ask. Some did ask, and never received answers. Trust collapsed quietly. Because trust does not break with noise, it breaks with realization. Officials responded carefully. They spoke in neutral language. They spoke of historical context. They spoke of different ethical standards. They spoke of necessity. They did not speak of responsibility. Investigations were launched. Committees were formed. Reports were written. Mistakes were acknowledged. But accountability remained abstract. No one went to prison. No one lost their license. No one was personally named. Because the system had no single face. And faceless things are hard to punish. The public moved on, as it always does. But something remained changed. People no longer saw institutions as purely protective. They saw them as powerful. And power always needs limits. Project Sunshine became a lesson, not about science, but about structure, about how harm can exist without cruelty, about how abuse can exist without intention, about how violations can exist without villains, and that is what makes it dangerous. Because if harm required evil, it would be rare. But harm only requires systems, and systems are everywhere. After the story became public, the world did what it always does. It paused. It reacted. It debated. And then it tried to move on. Governments issued statements. Institutions expressed regret. Committees promised reforms. Ethics boards were expanded. Consent procedures were strengthened. On paper, everything changed. In memory, nothing did. Because memory is not a document. It is not a policy. It is not a law. It is a feeling. And feelings do not obey regulations. For many families, the apologies felt hollow, not because they wanted punishment, but because nothing could return what had been taken. Nothing could restore the sense that their child had been respected. Nothing could undo the feeling of being used. Once trust is broken at that level, it does not heal. It becomes cautious. It becomes conditional. It becomes fragile. Science also changed. Before Sunshine, science felt neutral, objective, above morality. After Sunshine, science felt human, which means capable of error, capable of bias, capable of harm. People began to ask new questions. Not can we do this, but should we do this? Not is this efficient, but is this just? Not does this work, but who does it hurt? Those questions slowed progress. They complicated research. They added layers of review and oversight. But they also added something more important: humanity. Project Sunshine forced the world to recognize that systems are not moral. They are functional. They do what they are built to do. They optimize. They expand. They pursue goals. And morality only exists when people actively impose it, when people resist, when people refuse, when people say no. Without that resistance, systems drift toward efficiency, toward optimization, toward results, regardless of cost. Sunshine revealed that harm does not require hatred, only obedience, only silence, only acceptance. And that realization was uncomfortable because it meant the danger was not out there. It was inside procedures, inside hierarchies, inside ourselves. The story did not end with justice. It ended with awareness, and awareness is a weak form of protection. But it is better than blindness. Project Sunshine became a warning, not about the past, but about the future, about what happens when fear becomes policy, when urgency replaces consent, when authority replaces conscience. Because those conditions are not rare, they are common. They appear whenever people are afraid. And people are always afraid of something. That is why this story matters, not because it is shocking, but because it is normal. And normal is the most dangerous place for harm to live. Project Sunshine no longer exists. The program is closed. The files are archived. The laboratories are quiet. But its shadow remains, not in documents, not in reports, but in the way people now look at power, at authority, at science, at the idea of necessary harm. The story does not frighten because it is extreme. It frightens because it is ordinary, because nothing about it required cruelty. Only procedure, only silence, only compliance. And those things exist everywhere. Every system tells itself the same story. This is necessary. This is for the greater good. This is for safety. And every system believes it is different from the ones that came before, more ethical, more aware, more careful. But ethics are not inherited. They are practiced. They exist only when people actively choose them. Every form signed, every order followed, every instruction accepted, every silence maintained, is a moral decision, even when it does not feel like one. Project Sunshine teaches us that harm does not always come from evil intentions. It comes from good intentions without limits, from fear without reflection, from urgency without restraint, from progress without conscience. It reminds us that the most dangerous words are not, "we hate you." They are, "this is necessary." Because once something becomes necessary, it becomes unquestionable. And once it becomes unquestionable, it becomes unstoppable. Until someone stops it. And that someone is never the system. It is always a person. A doctor who refuses. A journalist who investigates. A parent who asks. A citizen who cares. That is how change happens. Not through policy, but through courage. Project Sunshine did not end because it was wrong. It ended because it was seen. And seeing is the first step towards stopping. That is why stories like this matter. They do not exist to accuse the past. They exist to protect the future. Not to shame institutions, but to remind people that institutions are made of people, and people can choose differently. If this story leaves you with discomfort, that is not a flaw. That is the point. Because comfort allows repetition. And discomfort creates awareness. And awareness is the only thing that stands between us and doing this again. Project Sunshine feels like history. Black and white photographs, typewritten reports, old government seals. But the pattern that created it is not old. It is alive. It appears every time fear becomes louder than conscience. Every time urgency replaces consent. Every time power becomes distant from consequence. Today, the materials are different. Not bones, not teeth, not tissue, but data, DNA, biometric information, behavioral patterns, location histories. The human body is no longer collected in laboratories. It is collected in databases. And just like before, most people do not know what is taken. They do not know how it is used. They do not know who decides. And they are rarely asked in a meaningful way. The language is familiar. It's for safety. It's for optimization. It's for your own good. The structure is familiar. Invisible systems, distributed responsibility, no clear accountability. And the people affected are familiar too. Children, minorities, the poor, the invisible. Project Sunshine teaches us that harm does not announce itself. It arrives as progress, as innovation, as protection. And that is why it is dangerous. Because danger wrapped in good intentions is hard to recognize. And once recognized, it is often already normal, already integrated, already accepted. That is why the responsibility does not belong to institutions alone. It belongs to individuals, to journalists who ask questions, to doctors who refuse unethical orders, to citizens who demand transparency, to viewers who do not look away. Because looking away is how harm survives. Project Sunshine did not begin with the villain. It began with silence. And silence is something every generation can choose to break or repeat. The future will judge us not by what we knew, but by what we accepted and what we refused to accept.